Hello, today is Wednesday, September 15th, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. On today's podcast, I'm joined by Ben Fox, one of TC2's managing directors. If you follow Staying Connected, you'll know that Ben and I have recorded a few podcasts this year where we discussed managed services and outsourcing deals. And today, we are going to talk about a related topic, and that is negotiating and contracting for large IT infrastructure projects. Hey, Ben, welcome back.
Hi, Joe. Nice to talk to you again.
So, Ben, why don't you start us off with some examples of the kind of large IT infrastructure projects we at LB3 and TC2 see?
Yes, certainly, Joe. So I think a large amount of the large IT infrastructure projects that we see, they tend to be related in some fashion to infrastructure refresh and upgrades and migrations. So, for instance, wireless LAN deployments and upgrades, programs to refresh users' PCs, programs to refresh end-of-support IT equipment, deployment of new technologies like SD-WAN, data center upgrades, migration of applications to the cloud, and so on. And then there's a lot of end user migrations to new technologies and applications. That's another big category. So not that long ago, a lot of enterprises were running programs to migrate to Windows 10. And more recently, there have been a lot of programs to migrate users over to Microsoft Teams, for instance. And of course, for many such programs, enterprises seek outside service providers to support and deliver them.
Now, large enterprise customers, they tend to apply fairly robust sourcing processes for IT services, but I sense that may not always be the case for these projects.
Yes, I would agree with that observation, I think, Joe. I think obviously companies do a lot of projects that are pretty small, pretty modest in size and don't really warrant a full sourcing process as such. But I think also companies often end up defaulting to a single supplier, even for far larger projects. This can be especially true for those service towers which are outsourced, where the outsourced provider almost gets all of the project work automatically. And I think sometimes that can result in complacent pricing, certainly, and sometimes perhaps complacent project delivery from the service provider. So I would say that for smaller projects, perhaps infrastructure refresh at a single site, for example, simply defaulting to your preferred provider is perfectly sensible. But I think for larger programs spanning multiple sites or many, many users, I think the benefits of applying some sourcing rigor are important. And of course, that sourcing process doesn't need to be particularly onerous. I think for project services, the right approach is a fairly straightforward request for quote style tender document, which should set out the statement of work for the required services and set out the key commercial parameters upon which the customer expects to purchase and pay for the work. It's really about getting a modest number of competitive quotes for performing the project so the customer can make informed choices and ensure it is getting a good deal.
So what are the attributes of a good deal for project services? I mean, in your view?
Good question. I think there are a few things I would focus on. Pricing, obviously always a focus, but project pricing is a function not only of the competitiveness of the rates for the professional resources being deployed, but also the seniority and relative expertise of the resources, the assumed number of hours to complete the work, and importantly, the degree to which onshore versus offshore resources deployed, which have a very different price point. So it's really important to understand how those attributes vary across the different proposals and compare them accordingly. The other thing that's really important to focus on, I find, is pricing variability, by which I mean the degree to which the customer desires and the supplier will offer a fixed price for the services, a fixed price for the scope of work. So if a fixed price is agreed to, it then becomes really important to be incredibly clear regarding what conditions cause the fixed pricing to change. For example, if the customer changes the volume of work under the statement of work, such as more users, more devices, and so on. If the customer changes the timeline the project needs to follow, particularly when it's a customer-imposed delay, that often causes the fixed pricing to change. And I think the reality is that large IT infrastructure projects, like all large programs, are unfortunately prone to delay and prone to overruns. And so more often than not, the conditions upon which the supplier agrees to fix the price, that's the most difficult part of the negotiation for these kind of services.
Now, these projects can be complex and cover sites and users from around the world. What about supplier commitments to deliver the work successfully and on time?
Yeah, so-called project SLAs, if you will, they do come up in these kind of negotiations. And I think customers always talk about suppliers having skin in the game and that kind of thing. But actually, I think the fixed price negotiation addresses a lot of that in a more effective fashion as it happens. If the price is fixed, then any delay caused by the supplier should cause them financial pain because they'll have to deploy their project team for longer without receiving extra compensation. So a fixed price already provides significant financial incentive for the supplier to meet their committed timelines, whether or not you also negotiate milestone commitments with penalties attached for not meeting those milestones. And by the way, Joe, one of the other timing issues to look at is how long the supplier wants to get going at the start of the project. Sometimes there can be a ramp-up period, 30 days or something, from executing the project statement of work before the supplier will commit to having the resources ready to start the work.
So once you've agreed pricing and scope with the selected supplier, the final step is, of course, to develop and negotiate the project statement of work for the services. Now, in my mind, and I'm sure in yours, Ben, and in our experience, a well-written SOW is invaluable. Do you have any advice on that phase of the negotiation?
Yes. Although, sadly, I think my advice is a bit of a reality check, really. And I've never really come across a supplier yet, a supplier of large IT infrastructure projects, that is particularly good at writing a comprehensive, precise statement of works. And yet, customers almost universally want the supplier to take the lead on writing the SOW. But unfortunately, it does tend to be the customer that suffers the most later when they find the SOW is not clear enough. So the only real answer to that is to be prepared to roll your sleeves up and work hard to make sure that the statement of work is as clear as possible. And people find that the statement of work development process, they find it a bit irritating and frustrating, I think, largely because at that point, everyone just wants to get on with the project. But I really do think actually that the statement of work should be seen as a very necessary evil, if you will. And I find that the process of developing a robust, precise statement of work actually uncovers a lot of scope issues and covers fixed pricing conditions and different perspectives between the customer and the supplier regarding who is doing what. And it's really far easier to address and resolve those kind of problems during the statement of work negotiation phase, rather than not finding them until later, until the statement of work is underway and having to negotiate that kind of dreaded change order.
So there's clearly a lot to negotiate for these large infrastructure projects. Are there certain things that can almost be, pre-negotiated and covered ahead of time for projects with a particular supplier?
Yes, definitely. For instance, customers typically have a master services agreement in place with suppliers that they ask to quote for these large IT infrastructure projects, so it really shouldn't be necessary to cover much in the way of T's and C's in the project statement of work. The other pre-negotiation can actually be the rates for resources. For instance, in application development and maintenance services, it is a fairly common practice to periodically negotiate resource rate cards across a bunch of suppliers and then lock down the rate cards for the next few years so that rates don't need to be negotiated every time work is required. And for large customers with a lot of ongoing project work, that exact same concept can also be applied to rate cards for IT infrastructure projects. So for instance, we've run RFPs where suppliers provide their competitive rate cards for project resources. And the outcome of the RFP is for the customer to select a modest number of quote unquote preferred IT infrastructure project suppliers with approved and highly competitive rate cards. And that removes one significant element of negotiations for individual large projects. But of course, it's still important to get multiple proposals for large projects from multiple preferred suppliers, because even with rate cards that have been negotiated and pre-agreed, you still need to look at and compare the seniority, relative expertise of the resources, the assumed number of hours to complete the work, and of course, the degree to which onshore versus offshore resources are deployed.
Okay, thank you, Ben. This has been very insightful. Now, if you would like to learn more about negotiating and contracting for large IT projects, or if you'd like to discuss other ICT needs with Ben, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues, please give us a call or shoot us an email. You can also stay current by subscribing to Staying Connected, checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.